Hello, and welcome back to our series on learning Google Apps Scripts for HR, brought to you by Prairie-HR-Solutions, where we believe knowledge should be shared, and in empowering our fellow HR professionals to really rethink how we deliver our HR services and solutions by using tools that we probably already have at our disposal. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie-HR-Solutions, and in this video, I would like to continue on with our user interface project. So where we left off, let's close this out here. Where we left off was we created a user interface for our employee database spreadsheet here, and we did that by creating a custom toolbar item here called HR Interface. Once you clicked on that, it would open up an item to where you can click on Open Sidebar, and it would run a script and then produce our dashboard over here, our sidebar. And then this is all HTML. And in our HTML, we have currently 3 different fields to where we can enter a employee ID, and then a last name, and a first name. Now, our next step is going to be having a user be able to submit this data, anything that they type inside this field here, and have it populate here on this spreadsheet. What we're ultimately creating is what's called a CRUD database. And what that is it's the ability to create, retrieve, update, and delete a record from, in our case, an employee database. So we're going to focus on the create portion first. So let's go back to our code side here. If you remember right, our code, our Google Apps Script, this is what we refer to as our server side. And then our HTML side, our sidebar, is what the user sees. This is our client side. As you can see, we have our fields here. And let's go ahead and remove this welcome, please select piece. We'll just have it say welcome. And what we're wanting to do is create a button so a user could push the button to record the data that they typed in. And we want that button to be at the very end of all of our fields. So we'll go to the end of our fields here and then create that button. We create the button by using a button tag, and we'll give that an ID. Let's say record button. And then what we want this record button to show the user is essentially what it does. So we could just type in record, and then we'll close that tag out. And now we have our button. So now we can save this and then go back to our sheet. Here, and this time when we refresh our sidebar, we should see our little button. Now a user can just mash this button, just mash as hard as they really want. It's not going to do anything because we haven't told our HTML page to do anything with it. We haven't even told it to listen for this click. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll go back to our page here, our script page. And what we're wanting to do is tell our page to listen for the click of this button. And then when it hears that click, we want it to do something. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about script and only referring to the script and code in our Code.js, our Google Apps Script side. Now, HTML can take JavaScript, and we're going to need it to run JavaScript in order to create a bridge, if you will, from our HTML side to our code side. To create JavaScript inside HTML, we use script tags. And everything inside these script tags, it will run as JavaScript. It will not show the script tags. This happens kind of behind the scenes, but everything inside here is JavaScript. So what we're wanting to do is initially tell our page to listen for the click of this button and then do something. So we'll use some built-in terminologies. And the first one we're going to use is a document. That says that we're using this, we're looking for this document and it applies to this document, this whole thing, our whole page here. Dot. And what we want to do is get an element, which all these input types and even the button is an element. And we want to get the ID of that element. So we start typing get element by ID, and you'll notice that it is in camel case. We will need parentheses, and inside the parentheses is the ID of whatever it is we're getting. In our case, we want this. We want to focus on that, which will bring our focus onto that button. Now, what we want to do with that button is we want to add, so we'll add our period, add an event listener, because we want it to listen for something. And what we want it to listen for is a click. Now, this event listener is going to take two different items. First, it's going to take, well, what am I listening for? And then the second, separated by a comma, is, well, what do you want me to do with it? I want you to run a function. So that function we will call poll info, because that's what it's going to do. And then we'll end that line with a semicolon. Now, if we were to save and run this, nothing would really happen because, one, it would hear the click, but this poll info doesn't exist yet. So we're going to have to create that. And we're still in our HTML because we haven't sent anything over to our Google app side yet. So let's create this function, poll info. And initially, let's just ensure that this function is being called correctly. And we can do that, if you remember right, by an alert. We can just create an alert box to pop up showing us that something is happening. So let's create that alert. And inside the parentheses for this alert, we can type text. So let's type in, I am the button and I got clicked. Something very simple like that in the line. So now what happens when we save and run it or push the button is it'll listen for the click. Once it hears that click, it will run this function, and this function right here will then produce an alert saying, I am the button and I got clicked. So if everything worked well, that's exactly what should happen. So let's go back over to our sheet. Now let's open our sidebar, and you'll see that we have our welcome. We got rid of the other piece. And now when we hit record, we should see the alert. And there it is. I am the button and I got clicked. Good. So now what we want to do is we want to go over and get the value initially of this input field right here. And what that input field corresponds to is, open this up, see if it gets a little bigger. Nope, it doesn't. What that input field is this one right here. So whatever the person types in there, we want to get that value. So to do this, we have to get the element by the ID, and this time the ID is that, but we have to get into the document and then use it. So we can actually use this piece right here, except this time we're not using the record button. We are getting the value of the imp number. So to get the value, instead of adding this event listener, we're not listening for anything. We just want the value. We can type dot value. Remember, we're in HTML and not Google Apps Script. If you remember right, get Google Apps Script, in order to get a value, you would type get value or get values. This is a different language, so we're in HTML. It's simply just dot value. So this will get the value of this, but we want to store this in a variable so we can use it. So let's go ahead and create a variable into this, and we'll call it, sorry for being original here, we'll just simply call it imp number. So now let's see if it's collecting the value of that correctly. And we can do that by creating an alert. And instead of putting words or text in this alert, we want to see the value of this variable. So we can simply pass that variable name in there and it will populate inside that alert box. So now let's save it. And we'll go back to our sheet. And we will refresh our sidebar. Now let's type in, say, I don't know, 10. And now when we press record this time, it'll show us that first alert. Then it'll run that second line of code once we close that alert. And then it'll run that second alert and show us the value. So now when we hit OK, it will then run the script to pull that value, which it did, and then show it to us in the alert. So the reason I left these alerts in here is to sort of illustrate the order of operations that a function runs in. It runs lines of code top to bottom. So it runs this one, and it doesn't run this line here until it's complete. So you'll see that when we start getting a little bit later on, but it runs this one first. Then once we hit OK, then it'll run that one real quick, and then it'll populate it. So good. So we actually have it working up to this point, and it's that value is stored in this variable. Now what we need to do is take that value or this variable and send it over to our Google Apps Script side to do something with. Ultimately, we are wanting to take that value and then add it onto the spreadsheet and create that record. So what we're wanting to do is we want to let HTML know that we are going to be working with Google Apps Script. And we're going to send it over to our server side, which is our code.js file. So to do that, we use a built-in terminology, built-in methods and statements of Google. Nope, Google. Yep, Google. Nope, spelled it wrong. There you go. There it is. No, I know how to get it. Google script run, and it does exactly what it says, Google script run. Now we're wanting it to run a script. We have to tell it what script to run. And in our case, we want it to run a script. Let's name it record data. And since it's a function, since we want it to run a function record data, we need those parentheses. We'll end the line. Now what we want to pass to this function is this variable. And whatever variable that is stored inside that, whatever value is stored inside that variable. So what we do is we pass that variable to that function. And what we can do is essentially create another alert here, and we'll get rid of all these alerts. I ran the function in GAS. Okay. So there we go. So now, if we were to run this, nothing would happen because we don't have this function created on our Google Apps Script, our server side, in order to do anything with. So nothing's going to happen. Let's go create that. Now you'll notice that we use the terminology imp number. We're going to use something different on our Google Apps Script, and it can be anything we want. I typically use something a little bit more descriptive just to keep my mindset that this is the HTML side. That's the variable on the HTML side. And then it's passing something different. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's go over here to our code and let's create that function. So function, it was record data, and we were passing this variable, But really, this variable is truly a record. So I'm going to have this argument state that it is basically a record. And we'll need the curly brackets. Now that we're on our Google Apps script side, we need to connect this function here to that sheet. Now, up here, you'll remember that we created these two variables, which essentially connected this function to the sheet. Now, since these variables are within this function, these are localized, which means that we can only use these variables inside this function. I could not call this variable or this variable. What I'd have to do is recreate all this. Once we get a little bit later into the series, we'll take these out and create a global variable, but right now we'll just retype it. And now what we're wanting to do is in that sheet, if you remember right, that sheet is this tab here. So inside this sheet, we want to append this value in a new row. And then if they type something else, we want to append a new row. Without erasing anything, we just want to keep adding rows. So now to do that, we can go in here and hit sheet dot. And what we want to do is append. You'll see it'll give a suggestion of append row, and that's what we want. It is a method. So we need our parentheses. And when we type in the parentheses, what it's going to ask for is the row contents. Essentially, well, what is it you wanted me to put in there? And each row content is a column. And if you remember how we got data in a spreadsheet through Google Apps Script, and this is the same with HTML and pulling it into JavaScript, our data is going to be inside of a array. So to state it's an array, we need our square brackets. And what we're going to pass to our sheet is what we got from our HTML side, this record. So I want to pause here after we save it. I want to pause here and walk through what is actually happening. So we'll go back over to our HTML side. So we created this button right here, and we gave it the ID of record button. And then we created a script in our HTML side. And in that script, we're wanting to tell the document or that page that we want to get an element by ID with this ID, which is our button. And then we want to add an event listener to that ID or that element. And we want it to listen for a click. And then once it hears that click, we want to run this function. So then we'll come down and pull this function. And this function is running. It'll initially give us an alert. I hit the button and I got clicked. And then it will create a variable named imp number. And that variable is essentially grabbing another element in the document with the ID of imp number, which is our first field, and we want to get the value of that element. After it gets the value of that element, it's going to produce an alert with that value. Then it's going to run a Google Apps script called record data, and that is going to be on our server side. And it's going to send it's going to send that function an argument of that value in the form of that variable. It's going to send that variable value over to that. And then it's going to fire off this alert saying, I ran the function in Google Apps Script. Now, once it runs this function with this argument over here in our Google Apps Script code, it's going to declare that we're using a spreadsheet app again, getting the active spreadsheet, and then it's going to create a variable called sheet, that is essentially the employee data tab. And on that sheet, it is going to append a row using the information that it received from the HTML side. So now if we coded this correctly, we'll refresh our sidebar here. If we coded this correctly, what should happen is if we type in 10 and hit record, we'll get our first alert. I am the button, and when I hit OK, it'll run that variable and pull the information from here, that 10, and then produce it in another alert. Now when I close it, what's going to happen is it's going to send it over to our server side and then run that code to append this 10 on our record. So when we hit OK, oh, I forgot about that one. It's going to tell us it ran the code and sent it over GS. Yep. Now you'll see that it populated that. So if we put in 21 and hit record and go through our alerts, 21 will populate on the next row. Good. So it works. So let's go through and remove all these alerts because we now know it works and we don't want to click through alerts all the time. Sometimes it's nice when you're troubleshooting your code to pepper alerts in your HTML so you can see where things are starting to stop. Going back to our code here, we would like to add in something else. So say we want to collect when the record was actually created. So what we can do is we can add in, let's do our new date. So that is a built-in function here with Google Apps Script. New date will produce the date that it was recorded. And you'll notice that the date is not typically like 12/2/24. It goes all the way down into the minutes and the seconds. And you'll realize that the append row, anytime that we do an array, if you remember, we separate elements of that array by a comma. So now what it will produce is a new date and then the record. So when we save this and we go back to our sheet, what will happen is it will produce the new date, then it will go over to the next column and then produce that record. So let's refresh our sidebar here. What we'll end up having to do is actually adjust our columns. So let's do 6, and then you'll notice that it ran that new date first, then it added the second element over into the next column, and that is the 6. So what we're going to do is we are going to add another column here and put entry date. Now what we're going to do, after we delete that, now what we'll do is when we hit record, it will take that date, the new date here, this is column 1, comma, this will be column 2, and it will create the date, and then it will populate whatever we put in there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's give it a try. Let's put in 10, record, and then what we can do is add another one, say 11, hit record, and then as you can see, it just keeps going on and on. So good. So now we created a record. Now what we want to do is create some more columns because we're going to have a lot more columns in our employee database than this. You'll notice that we have last name, first name. So let's add in a last name, and then this will be a first name. First name, and then before the job title, we'll need to know the division. And then we'll have the job title and the salary. Now, just because we changed our sheet doesn't mean that the code will not work. The code doesn't care about the way we did it. The code doesn't care about the way these are named or where they're at. It just knows that I am putting the new date in the first column and then the record in the second column. So if we were to put, say, 13 and we hit record, it's still going to work the same exact way. So let's go ahead and create our division, job title, and salary in our HTML. What we'll do is we'll go back over to our HTML here, and we need to create a couple more fields. So we'll need to create our division field. Now, I don't want to use the abbreviation div because we'll use that as a little bit later on. You can create a div class which separates elements, which we're going to have to do, as you'll see here in a second. So what I want to do is just call this division, and then it's not the first name, it is the division. It's going to be text. We'll make the ID also the division, the name also the division. And then we'll create another element with the label job title. And the user will see this label as job title. And the ID of this will be job title. And the name of it will be job title. Now, technically, we don't really need the name at this point, but I like having the name in there because it'll make it a lot easier once we start getting a lot of records in there. We can condense our code down to be just a few lines instead of multiple lines. And then our last one was salary. Okay. Salary. And of course, the ID, let's just keep it simple, say salary. And since our label is describing it, it should all be the same. Okay, good. So now what we'll do is let's go back. Now that we have these three created, now we'll go back and refresh our UI here. And you'll see how HTML, although if we just leave HTML, it can get very cluttered and just look kind of, well, gunky. So let's hit open sidebar to refresh. And as you can see, all of our fields are here, but it's just styled very, very wonky. So I want to end our videos here because next video, we will go through and add some style to this to where we can clean up the lines and maybe add a little bit of color and make this look a little bit more professional and nicer for the user. So I hope you like what we're doing so far. And if you do, please hit that subscribe button so we can continue to bring you content. It was a pleasure showing you this, and I look forward to our next video. Till then, take care.